This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a doctoral fellow at New York University's History Department, whose most recent research focuses on a love triangle from hell: Ukrainian nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the perception in the Russian discourse. Kathryn David, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the latest conflict in Ukraine over the Crimean peninsula brought to the fore many overt and covert hostilities, with the Jews being instrumentalized in the conflict between the two powers, between Russia and Ukraine, yet again. Mm-hmm. How did the Jews even end up playing a role in this war in the first place?
It's a very good question, and at first I have to say that I did not think that the Jews would play a role in this war. I had been living in Ukraine, in Odessa, studying the Jewish community from 2012 to 2013.
So before the conflict
Before the conflict started. And, you know, Jewishness was not really a part of the political discourse, the Jewish community. And in some parts of Ukraine, there was no awareness that there ever even was a Jewish community in Ukraine. But I believe that Jews began to be a part of things in Crimea because of Russia's justification for the annexation of Crimea, because Ukraine was a fascist government. And during Soviet times, fascist really didn't have much to do with, when countries were accused of being fascist, it had a lot more to do with anti-communism than anything that had to do with anti-Semitism. But in this day and age, Putin realized that the valence of the term fascism would bring up a lot of issues about Jews. And so I think once people started talking about fascism, people started asking questions about Jews.
Mm-hmm. But the thing is, it's strange because it's really the heritage of the Soviet Union that ceased to exist 25 years ago. So raising this red flag of fascism in today's Russia that is no longer communist, why does it even make sense?
I think that what you have to look at is sort of a pre-Soviet, Soviet, and post-Soviet relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And Russia's relationship with Ukraine, once Ukraine started to define itself as something separate from Russia, was sort of all about delegitimizing Ukrainian history, Ukrainian sovereignty. And so
How long ago are we talking about here?
Well, it depends who you ask.
Because the emergence of Ukrainian nationalism goes back decades, if not centuries.
Yes, I mean, people would say that Ukrainian nationalism began in the 19th century, but there were nationalisms that took place in Ukraine before then that actually wanted a close relationship with Russia. And these are called the Russophile Ukrainian nationalist movements that saw Ukraine as sort of a subsect of Russian culture. And that was the kind of nationalism that the Soviets also promoted. They said, yes, it's okay for Ukraine to be a nation as long as this is a nation that is within the Russian nation and that they look up to us.
That was even before the Bolshevik revolution.
Yes, that was in imperial Russia.
Yeah.
So it's a discourse that goes back a long time. And so, you know, a way for Russia to delegitimize Ukrainian history is to say that the current Ukrainian government is ultra-nationalist, ultra-fascist, and, you know, not this European state that it claims to be. So in that way, it has valence because a lot of Russians believe, even Russians who are suspicious of Putin, even Russians who don't consider themselves nationalists, they believe a lot of these things about Ukraine, that it's not a real country, it's not a real language, it's not a real culture. And so Putin was able to capitalize on that.
Okay, so that brings me again to my first question. How do the Jews fit into that matrix?
So the Jews fit into that matrix because of sort of two intersecting phenomena. The first one is that as much as it is a strange thing to admit, Putin has been good for the Jews of Russia. Putin makes direct appeals to Russian-speaking Jews, especially in Israel, who feel themselves to be more Russian as they've left Russia, which is not something that happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviets considered the Jews who left to not at all be Russian, and sort of this shame.
Traitors to the cause.
Traitors, exactly. And so it's this pivot that Putin has made, and he also realized, which I think is sort of something that is based on almost an anti-Semitic idea, that once you start bringing up Jews, that the international media starts to pay attention.
Bringing up Jews in what sense?
You bring up a country as being anti-Semitic.
Ah, okay. So to give them bad press, essentially.
Yes, especially because the people that Putin believed were behind everything in Ukraine was the United States, which, we can debate their role, but, he believes that, Americans want to think that they're supporting this liberal democracy in Ukraine. Look, these people are a bunch of anti-Semites. And
I have to say that part of the problem is that there is an element of truth in what he says, that there are big chunks of Ukrainian nationalism that are anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and that the thing about Putin's narratives, and I think the reason that people underestimate him so much, is because he's not making this stuff up. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. There's a lot of Ukrainian nationalist history and ideas that are explicitly anti-Semitic. But the fact is that Ukraine as a country and as a government is not a place that is hostile to the Jews. Their current president is Jewish. Far-right parties in Ukraine have not done well, especially compared to Western Europe, where they are doing well. And I think the last thing and the most important is that in Ukraine, supporting these nationalist heroes, people like Bandera and the Ukrainian Partisan Army, people who Jews see as anti-Semites, people in Ukraine often don't know that these people had anything to do with the genocide against the Jews. And so when they're...
The genocide, you mean the Holocaust?
The Holocaust, yes. So people have no idea that UPA and Bandera killed Jews, killed Poles. And so when they are praising Bandera, they are not praising him for those activities. Now, that doesn't make it, okay, and we can debate that. But I think there is something to be said, especially compared to other countries in the world where anti-Semitic people are praised for the fact that they were anti-Semitic, and that's not what's happening in Ukraine, in my view.
And what about the Jewish community in Ukraine? Which side do they take?
Well, there hasn't been a really large study of the Jewish community and Maidan and everything that's happened in Ukraine. Anecdotally, I can say that young Jews were much more in support of joining the EU, this association agreement, regime change in Ukraine, speaking Ukrainian instead of speaking Russian in some cases. But the most visible Ukrainian Jews are the oligarchs. And for the most part, they kind of are willing to go where the business is. Yeah. And so many of them were supporters of Yanukovych, now they're supporters of Poroshenko. But
the pro and anti-Russian candidates or politicians or leaders. Yeah.
Yes. But I think young Jews, for the most part, really are embracing Ukrainian nationalism, and they want to be included in it. And they don't see any difficulties in doing that.
So, and what about the Jews of Russia? I mean, is this creating a mini war between the two Jewish communities? One being loyal to their government and the other being loyal to theirs?
Yes, but it's not just within the Jewish community. It's within families, but it is playing out in strange ways in the Jewish community. In Israel, for example, the Russian-speaking Jewish community was very split about the annexation of Crimea. There was an article in Haaretz about this, that you had some Jews who believed that, this is great, Crimea will be under Putin and under Russia, and it will be a better place for the Jews. Then you had Jews who grew up more in Ukraine, even Soviet Ukraine, who said, no, this is Ukraine and this is Ukraine's land and all of that. So I think that definitely is playing out in the Jewish community, but it's really playing out among lots of different people.
Are the Jews in Ukraine more attuned to the historical baggage of these dog whistle accusations, if we may call them that?
Yes and no. Some are, but a lot of Jews in Ukraine are also not aware of the history of what happened in Ukraine in World War II. Because they, like Ukrainians, have been educated in Ukrainian schools. And just like schools in any country, you teach the rosiest version of your history.
Sure.
And so a lot of Jews are unaware about this. There's only one Holocaust museum in all of Ukraine, and it's privately run by this one man who opened it himself.
A Jew?
He's partially Jewish. He's not Jewish in the halachic sense.
Yeah.
And he found out about this based on his own family history. But in West Ukraine, I was talking to Ukrainians who lived there. They had no idea that there were ever Jews that lived there. And Jews also don't think that there were ever Jews in West Ukraine. So what you see a lot is sort of a knee-jerk reaction from Jews in Ukraine who will say, I've never experienced anti-Semitism. I have no problem, with people like Bandera. Because they see everything that Putin is saying as completely made up. But, more educated Jews or Jews who sort of maybe have studied the history more carefully or more maybe outside the country, they are aware of this. And it's something that they're very torn about. But for the most part, they tend to be okay with it.
Is there an open debate about that history of Ukraine inside in the public discourse in the country? What happens if someone brings up the less rosy chapters in the national history?
It's difficult because you have some scholars in Ukraine who are trying to put this in the public discourse. Yaroslav Hertzak is a top Ukrainian historian, and he is really trying. He's not at all Jewish or anything, but he's really trying to bring this history into the public discourse, as well as a lot of other academics. But the country passed this decommunization law, which says that, you can't disparage any Ukrainian nationalist heroes. So you can't call Bandera a fascist.
As some sort of reaction to Putin?
Yes, in a direct reaction, and a direct reaction to how the Soviets dealt with these historical figures. There's this Institute for National Memory. The man who runs it is completely crazy. I mean, there's no other way of saying it. He has a notion of history that is not at all based in any fact. But the people who are the most sort of protesting this are Ukrainian academics who would like this to be a part of the public discourse.
Not necessarily Jewish, or not at all. I mean,
Yeah.
the Jews are expectedly, I would say, more conscious of their volatile position within the society, and therefore they think twice before speaking out.
Yes, I think that's definitely the case. But I would say the vast majority of the people who are wanting to have a more open discussion are non-Jews, because they are people who really sort of believe in this vision of Ukraine as an inclusive place.
In light of the conflict, do you think that there's really a place for Jews in Ukraine? Does the Jewish community see itself as there for the foreseeable future?
I think it does. When the conflict started, when Russia began supporting these separatists and eventually invaded, a lot of Ukrainians began emigrating, and those who could emigrated to Israel because there was a war. I don't think that it was a fear of anti-Semitism, although, that may have played a role. But, I mean, the Jews that I meet in Ukraine do see a future for themselves there. I think their biggest concerns are the concerns that all Ukrainians have about the viability of the Ukrainian economy and of the government and of corruption. So not necessarily Jewish concerns, just more concerned about the future of the country in general.
Yeah. All right, Kathryn David, this is all very interesting, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for now. You're doctoral fellow at New York University's History Department, focusing on Ukrainian nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the Russian discourse. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
Well, I gotta stop believing in